Hi James, how are you? Welcome to AGI Inception.
Hello.
James, I request you to please introduce yourself a little bit.
Oh, sure, Rupesh, and thank you for inviting me to this series. It's quite interesting, as I'll talk about in the next 10 or so minutes. So my interaction with artificial intelligence has been quite interesting for me. It started a couple of years ago with Cognizant, one of the world's largest systems integrator and an early adopter and proponent of AI. We built out the AI messaging and the practice, have a couple of distinctive wrinkles there, such as evolutionary AI. And since then, I've been putting a lot of thought into AI's behavioral impacts, which we'll talk about a bit, and the way in which it ultimately affects everything from the economy to economic theory to the development of policies and principles for government.
And for the audience that don't know, James and I know each other for a long time now, and as a matter of fact, as he properly says, I was your first hire.
That's correct.
I remember correctly.
To build out an analytics practice, which is doing quite well.
So I'm glad to have James in here, and thank you for joining us. Go ahead, Rupesh.
Yeah. Before we move to the series, what are you working on, James, these days?
I'm currently working with a futurist strategy company called Tech 2025, where we specialize in two angles. One is helping to understand and predict the future, and the other is a practical roadmap to get there. So we believe it's a nice blend of the theoretical and the practical. And in that regard, I bring strategy and consulting to internal think tanks, internal prioritization planning meetings, and internal value discussions for my clients.
Wow. Let's now coming back to our theme of the podcast, we would need a first input for an artificial general intelligence, which is going to self-assemble itself. And that is also going to be one of the pillar of thoughts or the code of ethic. So what is your word going to be?
Well, I'm going to start, like any good consultant, by very subtly criticizing my predecessors. And by that, I was looking through the list of topics. And by the way, I love the concept. And Alberto and I were talking about this, quite some time back when you started this. The Asimov laws of robotics. Rupesh, your generation recognizes, but hasn't read the book. Our generation thought that Asimov would be an icon for generations, and even my own daughter barely recognizes his name. So it goes to show that fame can be fleeting. But we all know that AI needs to follow some sort of rules like the Asimov laws of robotics. But here's where I'll take a little bit of a poke, and I think that this is a chance maybe to turn the dialogue in this series. Looking over the topics you've had so far, I absolutely love them. Most recently, the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Then you've got responsibility and reciprocity. And the concept of how does AI go about learning, much like a Boy Scout or Girl Scout might learn a code of honor, it really is, if you're doing something, how do you do it? You do it, thoughtfully and kindly and the like. Then there were a couple of topics about the process of AI being AI. To me, the single best definition of AI is machines that learn by example. Very, very profound, very simple. And you had conversations about learning, conversations about, how AI should begin to experiment and ask why. And then you also had some guiding principles of altruism and compassion. Only one person, I see Shish Sridhar, I wanted to give a shout out to that, talked about transformation. And what I'd like to do is really pivot. All this talk we've discussed is how AI should behave when it does X. And make sure it's compassionate, make sure it doesn't kill us, make sure it helps us. You really haven't had a chance yet to ask, what is the X? Who gets to decide what it is that AI is going to do? So I started off by suggesting the word maximize to you, Rupesh, and you said, no, that's too vague. So I'm going to sneak in a two-word answer and say it's maximize value.
Maximize value, good.
What I think is really critical is that ultimately when we build a machine and set it off to do a largely autonomous task, we do have to tell it what it is we're trying to accomplish and what constraints are around that accomplishment. If your job is to maximize unemployment, you can borrow $1 trillion and offer literally everyone a job, but that eventually will fall apart when the borrowing stops. If your job is to sustain something, you have to maximize multiple angles in order to really come up with value, and you have to ask whether the time frame is next quarter or the next lifetime or the next century.
James, we have an advantage over you. We have other podcasts, and that is one of the ones that is going to come from Ray. She is one of the most In any room, I don't care, any room, she will always be the most intelligent person. I told that to Rupesh. And, you know, her word was translate, because what you just say from a point of a builder of a neural network, of a person that's what she does. The incredible thing is that it takes what you say, as you was explaining what you're doing right now, you know, from the strategic to the pathway or the roadmap, but then that person takes it and he make it a reality. And her word was translate, because she took it from where you are, value, maximize value, and then she says, how do you translate that into the consciousness, into how you imprint it into artificial intelligence? So yes, you are correct. Actually, not only you are correct, I think you have been able to give a very general, how can I say? Well, that's a skill that you have always had. You are able to explain complex topics to the layman, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing that, and I love the idea that translate is not translate language, although it is an extraordinarily difficult problem, but translate in kind of a classic mathematical sense, you know, that we all grew up with, translate and axis. So you're saying that if we could decide what X is and make sure that we have a careful set of boundaries, that translating that into action is really the last sort of step, or one might argue that getting public acceptance is maybe the last of the last steps. But I like where you're going. So it sounds like I'm sort of sandwiched between her discussing how to make whatever we decide AI wants to do work, and all the rules of engagement to make sure that AI doesn't kill us in the process of achieving its goal.
Yeah, and you think, let me ask you a question. I mean, I know professionally you talk about AI, etc., and the future and whatever. But what about outside of your professional circle, friends, family, etc., acquaintances? Does this topic of AI, how can impact and how could impact the future, has that ever come up?
Surprisingly, given that everyone knows I'm in the space, or maybe because of that, very few people venture an opinion. Although I do know there's a question about, hey, do you think, Elon Musk is right, AI can ruin humanity? Or there's something like, I hate chatbots, that must be AI, right? And we do sometimes talk about its shortcomings, but I actually don't hear it mentioned as often as I might think. In fact, I just a few days ago helped to monitor a podcast with Babak Hajat from Cognizant, and someone else asking, why hasn't AI shown a really significant role in the headlines around COVID-19? The biggest technology of our time and the biggest problem of the century, you rarely hear AI mentioned except with robots running up and down the halls of a hospital with a UV wand. If you Google AI COVID-19, most of it is trivial application, like the robots in the hospital. And I know in the background, AI is part of drug discovery, it's part of vaccine planning, but it hasn't hit the public consciousness. Nobody cares about it. And I think it's fascinating that AI has lost its place in public discourse when we probably needed it most, which was to handle a really complex multi-optimization problem of balancing human life with economic success.
You deal with the strategy, the roadmap. I brought Ray, that is going to come in a different podcast that talks about translation. And in the area I am right now,
what's that?
Is the language, the actual language. I believe that we are feeding language the wrong way, that the languages should be wave or vibrations. And that's the space I am right now. So for example, using COVID-19 as an example, you take all this data and you bring it as a digital data, text data, images, lab results, tables, charts, whatever. But that is just processing data. If what we want to move, I think, is to consciousness, we need to start with the basic laws of nature. Everything vibrates. Albert Einstein, I'm quoting. I may be wrong, but that's one of the laws of nature. So why don't get the vibrations on the data? Why would the data, even if it's digital data, will be exempt from the laws of nature? It just doesn't make any sense.
So it's kind of a signal from the noise problem, is what you're asking.
Well, and the microchips have become very, very good. First, you could detect 0 and 1, binary, but now you can do 0, 1, and in between you can do 0.00009 and on anything. On anything that it detects. It doesn't matter. It's language, it's text, it's whatever. So anyway, so what do you think is going to be the future of AI?
The reason I'm looking around, by the way, is I was just rereading Steven Strogat's book called Sync, S-Y-N-C-H, which talks about how even chaotic systems will eventually begin to synchronize. So, I think, Alberto, what you're saying is you may believe that people are behaving randomly, but in large groups, as we've seen in the last week and a half, there are certain patterns and behaves. And we begin, like your person who talked about reciprocity, we begin to interact with the very environment we're trying to model, and the model is no longer valid.
In biology, it's called self-assembly. It's an amazing thing. And something. One of the things that I want people to know that our listeners, that James is the right person for the strategy and the roadmap, and being able to translate, sometime to the corporate executive some concepts that may seem unattainable, but he can do that, and he's very good at it.
Well, thank you for that plug. And I do hope
always.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rupesh.
It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast, James. And I see around the time constraint, we're going to have to kind of wrap it up for today. And I'm looking forward to a lot of conversations with you about how and what the future of AI is going to be like.
Okay, same. I'm looking forward to the rest of your series, and a brilliant idea. So thank you, gentlemen, for both putting this on.
Thank you so much, James.